All right. It's always a little bit finicky in getting started, but we are live. So, welcome everybody to another amazing interview I get to do today. I've got the pleasure of being with Dale Borglum this afternoon. Uh, I am very, very excited to be able to bring Dale to my audience and just share, what Dale has been up to, the work that he's doing with the Living Dying Project and much, much more. So, Dale, thank you so much for taking the time and being with me in the space today and just seeing what we get to create together.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'll try to be friendly.
All right, sounds good. I'm just going to change one quick setting here, and we'll be good to go. So, there's we I mentioned in the description of this conversation today that one of the topics we're going to be discussing is this idea around the four mind turning truths. And really, this is one part of really a foundation of the work that you do. But I would love for you just to start off by sharing, tell us a little bit about your history. Where have you come from, and what has led you to this point in your life?
Well, that could be a very long story, a very short story, depending on what you want here. But I used to be a mathematician. I went to Cal and Stanford, went off to India with Ram Dass, came back, and he and I and Stephen Levine, just through circumstances, were at a place in the unfolding of our society where we looked around, and as people really interested in the Dharma and spiritual teachings and meditation saw that the one place, or at least the main place in society, that these contemplative truths had not penetrated was the encounter with death. That people were not wanting to talk about death. Let's talk about God, let's talk about meditation, but let's not talk about death. And even beyond that, certainly, if you can't talk about death, it's going to be virtually impossible to talk about conscious dying. And conscious dying is the outgrowth of having a conscious life. The way you live kind of determines the way you die. So anyway, back in the 70s and end of the 70s and then the 80s, Ram Dass, Stephen Levine, and I founded the conscious dying movement in the West. And I was the founder and director of the first residential facility. It was in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the early 80s for people to come who wanted to die consciously. They wanted to die awake. They wanted to die as fully present and open-hearted as possible. And ever since then, I haven't been running a facility anymore, but I've been training people to go out into the community, part of the time in New Mexico, mostly here back in Northern California, to take the traditional teachings of Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, all of the above, none of the above, whatever works for you. We'll use any language that makes you happy to bring these notions of awareness, compassion, embodiment, non-duality into the encounter with a life-threatening illness. And I am the executive director of this thing called the Living Dying Project. We have about 150 volunteers around the world who have been trained to work one-on-one free of charge with people who are either dying or grieving, who want to do this more consciously. And so we have these volunteers all around the country. They get all around the world. They get ongoing support. And I've been doing this now for about 45 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I mean, first of all, thank you for creating something like this. Again, it's no surprise that in the Western society that like this is an area that there isn't a lot of focus around, and so it really has an impact when something like this is available both for volunteers, for people who want to be of service, and also for those that are in their final stages and being conscious in that, part of life. Um, and I guess just the question I have, what do you tend to notice about folks who do live more consciously or are more just involved in this type of work? What type of a life generally gets created from this place?
Okay. Well, that's a really tricky question because there are people who have not been meditators, not overtly spiritual people, but through their lives, through their encounters with death and with nature and with childbirth and with music, whatever, psychedelic drugs potentially, have dealt with, to a certain extent, their own fear of death. And there are people that have done a whole bunch of meditating and they're still in denial. They're able to calm the mind to a certain extent and put on the spiritual outfit for meditation night or something. But it doesn't mean necessarily that you look into their eyes and you still see that fear of death. So as a
Hmm.
recovering mathematician, I have this formula. All fear is based in fear of death. And fear of death is equal to lack of enlightenment. It's the place where we're caught in feeling separate. Now, we are separate at a certain level. I'm here in California. You're not. Listeners, our viewers are scattered all over the place. And I'm not denying that there is this level where there's all this separateness. But at the same time, it's contextualized in wholeness, in oneness. Three guys just got a Nobel Prize in physics for quantum entanglement, which basically says there's only one thing. We live in the universe. There's one song, and there's Andrew, and there's Dale, and there's everybody else, including my microphone here, as part of that one thing, but it's just one thing, right? So that when you have that perspective, or even more accurately, when you have that perspective that has opened up into direct experience of this oneness, then conscious dying will take on a very different flavor and depth than if it's just something you're thinking about and reading in a book. So I teach a workshop to train people to do this on our website, livingdying.org. There's an online workshop that people anywhere can take and be trained to do this kind of work. And even if you're not interested in being at the bedside of people who are dying, having this more intimate relationship with death is life transforming. One of my first meditation teachers, Trungpa Rinpoche, said that until you come into intimate contact with death, your spiritual process will have the quality of you being a dilettante. Until we really know in the marrow of our bones that we're going to die, you can meditate till your knees fall off. You can pray till there are calluses on your knees. And you can fluff up your personality. You can get calmer. You can get a better job maybe. But the true deep fruit that is possible through contemplative practice is probably not going to be available.
Hmm. Yeah, and I've had the opportunity to listen to that course, and there are some great practices that I know that you cover both in that course and are also available on your website as well.
Correct.
Um, and it really, what I'm present to is that, again, we can kind of have a surface level relationship to the spirituality, to death itself, but unless we actually be with the fear and really, you know I get, like, even as you say, like, come to terms with the fact that we are going to die, and we really, like, be with that. um it almost feels like, we're going to be in that sort of a pattern. It's sort of a surface level pattern that never really gets to the heart of what's there.
The other thing I'd like to point out, and I completely agree with what you just said, and it kind of shook something up in my mind that I wanted to say before, is that we're not only talking about conscious dying in the terms of you or me or a volunteer being at the bedside of one patient, but collectively, at the level of society itself, there is denial of death. And because of that denial, all of the other fears that create aggression and greed uh, are not really solvable until we get down to the root cause, if you will. So that there may be no more direct thing you can do to end suffering in the world: homelessness, hunger, environmental degradation, mass migration because of that, what's happening to the environment. All these problems are going on. The incredible divisiveness politically in our country right now is driven by the fact people think, I'm separate from you, I'm going to die, you're going to die, I've got to take care of myself, and you're over there, and etc. Whereas when you know you're going to die, then there's a preciousness to each moment. And in fact, this might be a segue until to what you first started out by talking about here, is that in Buddhism, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I love talking Buddhist, because when I use words like love and God and stuff, I have no idea what people hear me saying, because everybody has their own woundedness probably from childhood and church and school and all those things. But in Buddhism, there are what are called the four mind turning truths, truths that turn your mind toward awakening, right? So that the first one is, as we are kind of been pointing out, you're going to die, but you don't know when. You're going to die, but you don't know when. Death is certain. The moment of death is uncertain. Nothing could be more intellectually obvious than that. But if we really knew that in the marrow of our bones, that Andrew and Dale and all of our viewers here didn't know that we were going to survive to the end of this podcast, the next 45 minutes or whatever it's going to be, how would it change the way that we were together right now? How would it change the willingness to be vulnerable, to be open to each other, to surrender into this next moment rather than being busy multitasking, doing all these things? Here we are. This moment is the chance, and this moment is the chance. Now, being a mathematician, I know that the probability that I'm going to die or you're going to die before the end of this podcast is pretty low, but it's not zero. It's not zero. And can that then just let me realize how precious it is to be with Andrew, who I've known for a while now, right? Which leads us to the second mind turning truth, which is that life is precious. Each moment is precious. As soon as it's experienced, it's gone. This is the only moment in which you or I can wake up. And beyond that, think about how precious it is to have a human birth where you're smart enough, open-hearted enough, wealthy enough, living in a stable enough country that you've got an hour to sit around talking about the stuff that we're going to talk about here, that you're not trying to make sure your children don't starve to death, or that the oppressive regime is going to come in and mess you up because you're saying the wrong things, or because the environment is so bad that your cattle are dying out in the yard because it's 120 degrees where you are, or something like that. So that's a real luxury. It's a precious opportunity to have this life where we can talk about truth and awakening and connection and the things that we're talking about. So you're going to die, but you don't know when, number one. Number two, life is precious. Number three, there's karma. What we do, think, or say has an effect. If we act selfishly, if we hurt people, if we hurt ourselves, it has an ongoing effect. I can't tell you how often I talk to people at the end of their lives who are trying to decide if their life is worth living at that point where there's so much cancer in their body or whatever it might be going on. And they're trying to decide, should I take those medicines to end my life right now? And to the extent that you do anything to push away suffering, that pushing creates an opposite effect. I'm not saying you can't choose to end your life, but can you do that openly? Can you do that consciously? Can you do that with love rather than, I want to get out of here, pushing it away, right? And the fourth one of these truths is that there is suffering. Suffering is a poor translation of a Pali word, Pali, the language that the Buddha spoke. And the word is dukkha, which means really suffering is one quality, but a more accurate term would be it's not satisfactory. Life is not satisfactory. It's unsatisfactory, right? When we get something that we like, it's eventually going to be gone. Often we're not getting enough, or we're getting too much, or my body hurts today, or my mind hurts today, or my money hurts today, whatever it is, that we're going around comparing what's happening with this imagined ideal. We're always a little bit disgruntled because there are these goalposts out there in our goal-oriented way of looking at things that we're moving toward. And if we should ever get to the goalpost, they magically move into the future again, right? They don't stay there very long, right? So you take these four truths. You're going to die, but you don't know when. Life is precious. There's karma, there's suffering. And you take one or all of them, but I would suggest taking one of them as a contemplation, not just something you think about intellectually, but like you wake up in the middle of the night, the first thing you think of, do I have to pee or not? But then the second thing you think is, I'm going to die, but I don't know when. In the middle of the night, you're lying there alone in your bed, or maybe your partner's in bed with you, whatever the situation is. And just let that sink into you. It's a contemplation. It's not a depressing one. It's not a morbid one. It's really, as the title suggests, it turns the mind toward awakening. It's a mind-turning truth. If we really know we're going to die, then now is the time to live. Now is the time to awaken.
Mm-hmm. The first time I heard those four mind-turning truths, they truly were, it stopped me in my tracks, I would say. And even today, when you brought the first truth, and even just placing that possibility of like, yeah, there could be a possibility that this could be the last conversation that we ever have.
Although we think other than a couple weeks, I think.
For sure. But the thing that was present there for me was truly like a deepening into the conversation. Maybe in that moment I was a little bit distracted, and it really brought me fully into the conversation of, hey, be present here. And I think that that's a real representation of embodying this more and more, truly, embracing these moments more and more of our life.
So that in some ways, what spiritual practice is about is, okay, you notice that you were a little distracted, but then suppose you go to the doctor, or your wife goes to the doctor, or your kid goes to the doctor and gets really bad news. Then it's harder to be present. There's all these difficult emotions flying around. Frustration, anger, fear, all these things are floating around. Can you be present then? So that even in this simple moment, we're training ourselves for more difficult moments. And then beyond that, it's all training for dying. And once again, not in a morbid way, but how much can you and I right now die into this next moment? And this moment, it's just a letting go into the next moment. And to the extent you can do that now, it makes it easier to die. To the extent that you're saying, oh my God, what's he talking about? This is weird, scary, whatever. You get all lost in concepts. Then that makes it a little more difficult to die consciously. Right. So that It's not you're going to get a grade in dying, like God's going to give you a B minus or a B plus or even an A if you're really a good boy or a good girl. But that each moment is preparation. Each moment is, how alive can I be right now? How much passion and aliveness and energy and compassion can I bring to this moment?
Hmm. And so for folks that and again, I realize that you're speaking to some of these processes, but for folks that are new coming into this work, maybe being exposed to these concepts for the first time, where do you generally tend to maybe just like what would be a place of guidance or resource, something that you tend to point people towards?
That's very individual. I mean, I used to be a meditation teacher, which I think is a slightly dangerous idea because people think, oh, maybe I should meditate, or I'm not meditating well enough, or look how good I am at meditating. And we just kind of appropriate meditation for the purposes of the ego rather than using it to dissolve our identification with the ego. So it depends on who somebody is. But in general, I think mindfulness is a good thing. Yet in the West, mindfulness often is too much in the head. And a lot of these Asian practices that come from Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam were developed by and for people over there in the East a long time ago who were walking around barefoot, didn't have an iPhone or a car, and were grounded and centered. They were in their body in a certain way that most Westerners aren't. So I really emphasize embodiment, getting grounded and centered. That's some of the work you and I have been doing together, being in the bodies. Can you be in your body when strong emotions are happening? Or do you immediately go up in your head, the mind starts spinning and you're lost in concepts? So that as long as we're lost in concepts, we're not really present in the moment. We're having a concept about the moment. And certainly one can use the mind. You need to make a shopping list. You need to plan your next day or next week or whatever. Fine to use the mind. But a lot of the way the mind is arising is just trying to fill up the space because space is scary. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So as long as that inner monologue is going, 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 as unpleasant as it often is, as distracting as it often is, it keeps us from settling down into the present moment, being embodied. And that embodiment then supports the heart opening so that we can have deep, loving relationships. We can have compassion, the open heart meeting suffering in ourselves and in other beings. We can think about the coming election. We can think about how AI might be changing society, how a lot of people are going to be going through a lot of turmoil because of these things, politics, technology, weather, whatever it is, and have a foundation to stay solid enough that we can have compassion, stay open hearted, even though a lot of people around us are spinning out of control.
Hmm.
And I really think, and I'm not a prognosticator, I'm really not, but I really think the next 5 years are going to be really chaotic in America in particular because of politics and uh, Trump's indictments. And people are going to be extremely angry and unhappy and fearful. The climate's going to be getting worse, almost certainly. Just seeing the beginning of all this. So that
Hmm.
having these practices of cultivating some mindfulness and cultivating some compassion, the ability to keep the heart open in response to suffering, I think will stand people in very good stead in relationship to how confusing and chaotic society might be in the next 5 years or so, at least.
Hmm. One question that was coming up for me as you were speaking there, for somebody again who is potentially just coming into this work and maybe they have a family member that is dying or suffering from a chronic illness, like what would what would you share to for, for that person to show up for that individual? Because I imagine that when we have folks that are dying, in our families or friends, that like they're, and maybe this is just my perspective, but like there's often a feeling of like I should be doing something. I should be, showing up a certain way.
Right.
So I'm curious as to like what you see around that. And if you want me to ask you a different question, I can, like around this.
Every question is a good question. I don't know. So, first of all, I really talk about caregiving as work on yourself. And as long as you're saying, I've got to help my mother, I've got to fix my father, I've got to be there for my child, that's lovely. But if you're doing that at the expense of really paying attention to what your own feelings are, you're going to be getting lost in that process. So it's like on the plane. They say if the plane's going down, if there's a problem with the oxygen, you put it on your own face before you put it on the kid next to you, right? And it's the same thing here, that when you're working with somebody, particularly somebody you really deeply care about and love, it's very easy to get lost in their suffering and saying, oh my God, I've got to fix that. Or let me help more and more and more. And it takes practice to be able to be present, to be grounded, centered, embodied, have this mindfulness of what you're feeling and a compassionate response to suffering. And then from that place, then the help is coming out. It's almost like a martial art, right? It's not like I'm fighting you, but the chi of the universe is flowing through me, as would happen in Qigong or Tai Chi or Karate or any of those martial arts. And that's how a tiny, frail, elderly martial arts master can defeat a big, hulking novice, because he's or she is not doing it. They're letting the chi of the universe flow through them. They're centered, they're present, they're mindful. And the work is getting done. It's getting done much more effectively than somebody's thinking, I've got to do all this. And as I say, it's easy for me to say those things, but when it's a dear friend or a close relative who's really suffering, it is so easy to get lost in that relationship in that moment.
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Um, and one of the practices that you shared with me as well, which we won't necessarily dive into today, but you've shared this practice on your podcast of Tonglen,
Right.
which I think is a beautiful practice that um, can support somebody in taking on, suffering and without actually having to physically, be out in the world doing things or trying to like make a difference. It's a very, embodied practice. um, so the piece that I would share there for folks is like if you are interested in a practice around this, that Tonglen is a great practice, and Dale shares it on his podcast as well, um, among other practices as well. So I did want to put that in there.
Let me jump in if I could. It's not really
Yeah.
taking on suffering. I think that's giving people the wrong idea that I'm taking your suffering. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm kind of letting it go through me, but it's not like you're taking somebody's suffering and holding on to it. And
Hmm.
as Andrew's pointing out, on our website, livingdying.org, there is a lot of free information, more than any other place on the internet that I've seen, about conscious living and conscious dying. There's lectures, meditations, guided this, that, videos. There's this workshop that presents these things that you were part of, Andrew. And there's also a podcast I have on the Be Here Now network that has all this information for free. As well, I have an every other Saturday Zoom group that has about 580 people in it. A lot of people don't show up because it's Saturday, but everybody gets the recording, people all over the world. So there's a lot of free information. And uh, just if you want, just come to the website as well. We're having a benefit this Sunday with Sharon Salzberg, who's a wonderful Vipassana teacher. And I think that the title of her talk is "Let's Get Real."
Hmm. Yeah, and I'll make sure to share those links in the comments as well afterwards, for people to be able to have access to them, because um, truly there is so much great um, resources and practices that are available. And on the podcast is called Healing at the Edge. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
do.
it's an amazing podcast.
I do have a spiritual name, so it's kind of confusing. Sometimes I'm called Dale, and sometimes Ramdev, Remdev, and I think it's more Ramdev. It's Ramdev Dale Borglum on the Be Here Now network. But there's links to all that stuff in very obvious places on our website.
Absolutely. Um, and so the next question I have for you really is, what is next for you? What are you up to? What are you creating in the world right now that you're particularly proud of?
Well, I'm proud of my son, and he and I are going to go to the Yucatan in Mexico in a couple weeks. Uh, I just wrote a book, or let's say I just completed a manuscript, and it's out for blurbs and writing the proposal, and it's going to go to the publisher and hopefully later this month. So I don't know how proud I am of that, but I'm really glad it's done. I think it's a good book, but writing books is not my favorite thing. Uh,
Hmm.
I like talking, I like running around, but typing out a book is not my favorite thing. Uh,
And what is the theme of the book?
well, it's called Life in a Body, and the subtitle is How You Can Live Your Life So You Can Die Without How to Live Your Life So You Can Die Without Fear.
Mm.
And it's got three parts to it. The first part is a memoir of little Dale. Dale goes to Stanford. Dale goes to India. Dale lives with Ram Dass. Dale works with dying people, just to give the book some context and me some credibility. The second part of the book is this healing paradigm that I've been very loosely alluding to, of the mind turning truths and mindfulness and embodied mindfulness and compassion and tantra and non-duality. And then the third part of the book is applying this healing paradigm to grieving, caregiving, and dying, end of life issues.
Hmm. That's amazing. I mean, really, um, just both an exciting and I would just say encompassing resource, for all of us to, again, like, understand, the healing paradigm, what we've been speaking about in the conversation, and being able to use that so as to better support others. That sounds, I'm excited for when that does get released. Do you have a, a potential release date in mind for it?
I don't. I mean, it really depends on how long the publisher wants to diddle around with it before they print it up.
Hmm.
So I've written the manuscript, then they start saying, "Hey, chapter 3, you got to do more of this or something." I don't know how long that part's going to take.
Hmm. One thing I'll say is, if you can, and there's a willingness there, make sure to put it on audiobook because it'd be so great to have that,
Yeah, I'm definitely planning to do that. Thank you, Andrew.
for sure. Um, well, we'll start to wind down here for today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the viewers that are with us now, or with the folks that might get to watch the replay at another point?
Well, uh, like I was saying before, I really do think that we're living in a difficult and confusing time in the history of humanity. And it, when I think about living in the world right now and not having the practices that I have, it's hard to imagine how much different that would be, how much more difficult that would be. So that I think that both having some kind of inner contemplative practice where you're really becoming more familiar with yourself. You're being able to love and forgive yourself more. And then combining that with some outer practice of service in the world. Maybe not your full-time job, but maybe you're a mother, maybe you're a lawyer, maybe you're who knows what you're, maybe you're a baseball player, but that you're doing something in your life to serve people. And particularly if you ever have the opportunity to be around somebody who's dying, that the strongest spiritual practice is this inner contemplative practice combined with this outer relationship with death. And when you meet somebody who hasn't really confronted death yet, who hasn't looked death in the eye, you can feel that. And when you meet somebody who's at least partly begun to process their own fear of death, how alone we are, how connected we are, how all these different things are going on at the same time. Until we really know we're going to die, you're going to die, but you don't know when, that first mind-turning truth, until we've really taken that into the marrow of our bones, into the depth of our heart, then it's going to limit the way you can love your children. It's going to limit the way you can love yourself. It's going to limit the way you can love God or your partner or the planet itself. So that finding these practices, finding this ability to connect with yourself, connect with those around you, connect with God, connect with the planet. And we don't have to call it God. If you want to be a Buddhist or an atheist, it's completely fine. It's the same conversation. Just change the words a little bit, right? This is not God talk. It's really finding a connection with that which is real and true and living from that, a life of integrity. And to me, it's got to include death because it's such a critical part of our journey here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I mean, really, there's just so much wisdom in that, right? In connecting, having that inner practice and connecting that to a place of service out in the world, whatever that looks like for an individual. So thanks for sharing that as a final note. And thanks for being willing to spend this time with us and share your work because it truly is it's amazing work.
My,
I know I'm giving you a little bit of acknowledgement there, but may I actually acknowledge you for the qualities that you bring to the conversation, to the world.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate who you are too, Andrew, very much.
Hmm. Um, I will actually acknowledge you just with the qualities that I experience. I really want to acknowledge you for just the life, the being that you are. I so very much just feel connected, and I feel the love that you bring to the world. It's encompassing. It's um, it's life giving, and um, every time I get to hear you on a podcast or hear you speak, um, there's a real depth there, a real um, love, a real generosity that you bring to the world. I really also want to acknowledge you for the humor that you bring. That in this work, it could be seen as heavy or challenging, but who you are is you bring a lightness to this as well. You bring this into a place that we can have conversation and be together. In that. So thank you for what you are doing in the world and for who you're being. It's truly a gift.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I appreciate it. When you were talking about humor, it made me think of my first meditation teacher, Suzuki Roshi, who said, the essence of Zen Buddhism can be summarized in 2 words: just let go.
Mm-hmm. It's fitting.
3 words. God, you got the joke there.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh.
Might have taken me a minute to catch on for that.
Okay. Well, thank you for
uh,
having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Um, Last thing I just want to put in, if somebody does want to get in contact with you from listening to this interview at some point, what's the best way that people can connect with you?
Okay, well, if you go to our website, living dying, one word, livingdying.org, uh, on the bottom of every page is an email address, and that goes to me and my assistant. We both get it. The email address is info@livingdying.org. Or you could just Google Living Dying Project, and you'll there it is. Or you can Google Dale Borglum, and there it is. So, and maybe you'll drop a couple links there in
I
the
will.
chat function or whatever they call it on this platform.
Absolutely. And for the folks that do catch this on the replay, if you have any other questions or curiosities about this conversation today, please feel free to share them, and I'll be sure to address them or even bring them to Dale, and we'll see what we can get from that. But thanks everybody for listening in today, and yeah, talk to you soon.